stand, please, sir. Under Kansas law, you have the right to say anything you want to or present any evidence you want to with regard to this matter before I impose sentence. If there's anything you want to say, I'll hear from you at this time. You can stand there.
All right. I didn't get much of a chance to do this during trial, to actually confront witnesses against me. But today I get to do that. Today I'm going to start with Taylor Forrest, because Taylor Forrest is the best among them. Taylor Forrest's only fault is her youth. Taylor Forrest's only fault in this matter is that she hasn't gotten to know Vashti's family. She doesn't know what they're capable of, only what her father is capable of. Taylor Forrest talked about threats to her family. Well, that's entirely true. I did threaten a member of her family. I threatened Vashti's father. I remember one day we were visiting Taylor and her new stepmom and her stepbrother, and I walked into a room to find him strangling a 10-year-old boy. Yeah, I threatened him. I said, "Get your fucking hands off him." Years later, Vashti was telling me some trouble that Taylor was having with her father. Again, I threatened him. I said, "If you ever touch my fucking sister, I'll kill you." And I said that, my sister. Because that's how Vashti thought of you, and that's how I thought of you. Taylor Forrest, I swear to God I didn't kill your sister. I've never hurt your sister. I've never done anything to your sister. In fact, that's what every witness statement said, is that Brett Seacat has never hurt her. Brett Seacat has never been cruel to her. Brett Seacat has never even yelled at her. You talked about arrogance. In fact, every one of you talked about arrogance. You said that I was arrogant in believing that I could destroy evidence of a crime. That's ridiculous. I teach about crimes. I know what covers up crimes and what doesn't. I know that a bullet hole has never been covered up by a fire. I know that a murder has never been concealed by means of fire. I wouldn't have lit a fire to try and cover this up. You talked about Vashti. You talked about how beautiful she was, how brave she was, how strong she was. And she talked about telling the boys all of these things, along with that she was always watching them from heaven. The exact same things I was telling them that very day. Vashti did love you. She still does. She always tried to protect you, and she always will. I'm sorry that you believe what you do, but I understand how your beliefs have been shaped. You never really got to know me. I was just the guy who stood between your dad and you. Speaking of your dad, Clint Forrest, you took the podium and addressed the entire courtroom as Vashti's father, but you have never been Vashti's father. Ever. You've been a lot of things to Vashti. You've been her abuser, her molester, and one of the elements that helped drive her to what she did. You talked about statements that Vashti had made, that Brett had claimed he was going to kill her, burn the house down, make it look like suicide. What's funny, all these statements never came to light until after several interviews had been done with the same people. None of them apparently thought this was important information at the beginning of this investigation. Only after talking to KBI agents several times did they decide, well, maybe Vashti did say this sometime, and we're going to say that she did. As for Brendan and Bronson, well, as for Vashti and Brendan and Bronson and you, Clint Force, our one disagreement, our real disagreement, was that she could forgive you for everything you had done, and I could not. I forbid my grandchildren or my sons from ever seeing you. Vashti disagreed with that. Vashti had an unlimited reservoir for forgiveness, and she forgave you for everything you had ever done. I certainly wasn't, and I knew you weren't done, so I never let the boys anywhere near you. And that's all the time you deserve. But there's an apple that didn't fall far from your tree, and that's Rich Forrest. He talked about how my actions have been detrimental to the family. This from a man who abused Vashti, abused his own children, abused his wife, abused drugs. A man who talks about Brendan and Bronson. And yet, Vashti's rule with Rich was that Brendan and Bronson were never to be left alone with him. He talks about accusations leveled against him and against his family by me and my family. I know my family has leveled no accusations against him, and I know I haven't said anything about Rich Forrest until this day. See, I've had a gag order on me. No one's ever asked me about Rich. I've never talked to the press. I've never been interviewed. And yet he seems to think these accusations, which came up in court from Vashti's counselor, who had talked about what Rich had done, were somehow from me. He talks about his beloved sister, but he never treated her like a beloved sister. See, Vashti told me what he did to her when she was 22 years old.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. Inappropriate. This is supposed to be his time to speak about his actions, and I think this is improper.
I want to hear statements regarding this case. That's what's relevant to me. So I'd like to address your guilt or lack thereof. That's the purpose of the allocution and the sentence to be imposed. Go ahead.
Very well, Your Honor. I will steer clear of any of the accusations made against me and stick to the case in question. Jeff Kamnikar made a lot of statements talking about evidence that did not come up in court. Talked about his wife being Vashti's best friend. It's funny how Vashti was only friends with his wife when Vashti fell off the wagon. He asked me to admit my actions. I have admitted my actions. I spent 19 years trying to protect Vashti from the damage that family had done, and in the end I failed. That was my action. He talks about me shooting Vashti in her sleep, yet he doesn't talk about the physical evidence that the state had in their own possession that proved Vashti was not only awake and calling her family 10 minutes before she called me, but also that she was sitting upright when she was shot. Strange that I could somehow make my wife sit upright while I shoot her. Talks about me shooting Vashti in the neck, and he talks about the first words he heard from me that day. Interesting also that when I called him, I told him Vashti had shot herself in the mouth. Yet that didn't come up in court. Strange that a man who supposedly shot his wife doesn't even know where she was actually shot. Talked about how a clock was running out how I had to kill Vashti that night. This has never made sense to me. I don't know why I would rush to kill my wife when, if I wanted her dead, I'd have a whole lifetime to do it. He talks about these mysterious Saturday plans that Vashti had, and yet Vashti had signed up for a pay-per-view fight that was going to be showing Saturday night. A pay-per-view fight Cox Communications only allowed her to watch if she was there to monitor it, which means she meant to be at our house all Saturday night. Funny how all these plans appeared after Vashti's death. He talks about the corgis. He talks about how they bark at the slightest sound. I think this is odd, since, yes, they do bark. They bark at doorbells. They bark at intruders, possibly. But they don't bark at Vashti or I coming and going from the house. Never have. He talks about stepping on a floorboard and the corgis barking like crazy when he has never been in our house. Well, he's never spent the night in our house, so I don't know how he knows this. He talks about the statements of a 4-year-old taken 2 days later that the corgis were in the car. Well, the statements recorded by the state that morning from Brendan don't say that. He talks about how Vashti was having insurance switched over to Kathleen. This is common in Kathleen's statements as well. And yet, there's no trace of this. In fact, Kathleen even called Cox and tried to convince him that Vashti had switched her insurance over to her so that Kathleen could get some money. The people at Cox told her all Vashti would have to do to change her insurance is to get at the computer screen because Vashti's job entailed changing insurance. And that's one of the key things here, is insurance. Vashti's family, several times after Vashti's suicide, told me that they had seen this coming, that they knew she committed suicide. But when it came down to money, they changed their mind. Because with Vashti's suicide, they get no money. But with Vashti's murder, they do. Cam Nakar also talked about smoke, talked about fire. Somehow he knows how much smoke can build up, how many cubic feet were in our house. He knows how long I was in the house. He somehow knows all this information, and yet has never capitalized on it by pursuing a job in arson investigation. He talks about how my hair was unburnt. Unburnt from flames that I described to investigators, and they documented as being 8 inches tall. I'm not sure how 8 inches of fire could somehow reach my head and burn it, but I guess that will stand up in court. He talked about some mysterious visit where I was at their house, and I described, I'm going to get away with murder, and the KBI will never know it. Apparently, years ago, I was planning to kill Vashti, and I was apparently sure that the KBI would investigate it. He immediately jumped to a frame job. Funny that he should jump so quickly to something that he knew happened. He talks about photographs and how Vashti was always happy in the last months, always smiling. Well, I defy him to find a picture ever of Vashti where she wasn't smiling. There were photographs taken of her immediately after, well, not immediately after, days after she was raped. She was smiling in those photographs. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that perhaps Vashti had a false face that she presented to everyone. I know it, but I don't feel like talking about it anymore now. When I met Vashti, she was 14 years old. She had already tried to commit suicide once. Her family told her never to tell anyone, that people would think she was crazy. This is how her family helped her. The family that loved her so much. On a Friday in 1994, I arrived just in time to stop Vashti from shooting herself. When her high school counselor put Vashti in contact with a psychologist, her mother's reaction was to accuse Vashti of making it up, just so people would think she was a bad mother. Her stepdad told Vashti not to go. He didn't want their insurance to go up. This is how her family helped her. Family that loved her so much. And things only got worse for Vashti. After a childhood of physical, mental, and sexual abuse, you'd think it'd be over, but it wasn't. In 2001, at 22 years old, as a 22-year-old adult, Vashti was drugged and raped by a family member. When she told her mother and sister, they turned on her and basically kicked her out of the family that loved her so much. This drove Vashti to 2 more suicide attempts almost immediately after that. The second of which landed her in the hospital. Their reaction was the same. Don't get help. If you do, people will think you're crazy. This was the advice of the family that loved her so much. And Vashti's best friend, Kathleen, when Vashti got engaged to me, Kathleen didn't speak to her for 3 years. Over those following years, Vashti's life, along with her relationship with her family, had its ups and downs. She gave birth to 2 wonderful little boys and also tried to kill herself 3 times. She told them, and their response was always the same: criticize but don't help. Guess that's because they loved her so much. On the last Wednesday of Vashti's life, her mother stopped speaking to her, the mother that loved her so much. The next day, her sister stopped speaking to her, the sister that loved her so much. And the day after that, I stopped helping her. I stopped backing her up. I stopped looking after her. I turned on her. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Vashti's suicide was my fault. In my life, I've saved a lot of people from death, none more often than Vashti. But no matter how many times you save someone, you can only fail to save them once. I failed with Vashti, and it is the first and last thing I think about every day. 7 days after Vashti's suicide, her sister told me, "It was your job to keep this from happening." And she was right. It was my job, because it was a job they certainly never took. I understand that today is not my day. I understand, even though I'm the one being sentenced, this day does not belong to me. This day was meant for people who made sure it would happen. This day belongs to you, Judge Solomon. This is your day. This is the day you get to take your place in front of the cameras and pass sentence on a man you worked so hard to convict. A man you know was innocent, but a man you had to help convict so you could get this day, your day. The day that you've been planning on since May 12th, 2011, when you met with Vashti's family and told them you were going to sentence me to the hard 50. Before I was even in custody, before you'd seen an affidavit, before you'd seen any of the evidence you'd later helped to suppress, before a trial and before a verdict, you were already guaranteeing death in prison. Because that's the kind of sentence you believe will bring you the publicity you need for a Kansas Supreme Court nomination. A nomination that wouldn't have been possible without this day. It was at that same meeting with Vashti's family where you also made a deal to give them custody of my children after I was conveniently out of the way. Custody that would pay off in the form of Vashti's insurance, but only if I were convicted. And that's the key word for this meeting: pay off. So go ahead and collect your 30 pieces of silver, Judge Solomon. Go ahead and sell custody of my little boys to Vashti's family. Give them 2 more children's lives to destroy. Go ahead and pass a life sentence. Go ahead and pass the sentence Vashti's family bought from you 2 years ago. Go ahead and pass the sentence that you hope will get the biggest headline. Go ahead and pass the sentence you think will land you a spot on the Kansas Supreme Court. Go ahead and pass the sentence that guarantees your spot in hell. Because the sentence you believe will profit you most in this life is going to damn you in the next. Just like Amy Hanley, Jeff Newsom, and those 12 jurors, you are going to hell for what you've done in this case. And it's all for nothing. Because the evidence you helped suppress still exists. Evidence you were aware of from the very beginning. Evidence that you knew prove the state was lying. Evidence that proves I'm innocent. Evidence you wouldn't allow because then you wouldn't get this day. But this evidence will bring about a new trial. Your corrupt decisions will bring an appeal. The evidence will be presented and I will be freed. And with that, I'll step aside and let you have your day. After all, you purchased it with your soul, so you've earned it.
Do you know of any just or legal cause why sentence should not be imposed at this time?
The state knows of none, Your Honor.
Well, I heard many things today that I anticipated hearing. The family addressed many of the issues that I wanted to address. I heard a few things I didn't anticipate. I won't bother addressing them because they're so bizarre they don't deserve a response. They merely affirmed to me that a jury of 12 Kingman County citizens made the appropriate decision in this case. As I said earlier, your guilt in this case was overwhelming. Evidence to support your defense of suicide was totally unbelievable and virtually unsupported by any credible evidence. The trial of this matter revealed more than your guilt, however. You claimed to be Vashti's protector, and in the next breath on the stand said the evening in question you would destroy her. And destroy her you did. At trial you made every effort possible to drag her name and her memory and her reputation through the mud. But the evidence in this case showed several things. First, that Vashti was a caring and loving mother who took care of her children and whose children worshiped her. All you had to do is take the time to read that journal and understand how they cared for their mother. Second, Vashti was a dedicated professional who worked at Cox Communications and who was respected and liked by her friends and fellow workers there. Third, she was an outgoing and fun-loving person with numerous close friends and acquaintances, several of whom testified at trial. And fourth, and most importantly, the evidence at this trial showed beyond a reasonable doubt that on April 30th, 2011, Vashti was not indecisive about divorcing you. She was not depressed and she was not suicidal. In fact, she was looking forward to a future with her 2 sons after the divorce was finalized. And that was a future that you took away from her and your 2 sons. The families hit it on the head, so did several witnesses at trial, about you being arrogant, about you being controlling, about you being self-centered and narcissistic. And your statement here today confirms that to me. And we do know that you thought you were smarter than law enforcement, you thought you were smarter than fire officials, and you thought you were smarter than 12 jurors who heard this case. And in the end, of course, we know that you weren't smarter than any of them. Your statement this morning confirms to me that you live in some sort of bizarre, alternate reality. It bears zero reality to the case that was tried and the evidence that was presented in this matter. I've taken into account all of the evidence. I've taken into account your statements. I've taken into account all of the victims' statements, including a written statement from an aunt, which was forwarded to me also. Pardon me, I believe it was stepmother of Vashti. And I've considered all of that in determining the sentence to impose upon you. I've also considered the fact that you haven't admitted guilt, you haven't admitted responsibility, and you didn't this morning even express remorse that Vashti's no longer on this earth. One of the victim's family asked me to show you no mercy, and I don't intend to show you any mercy. You didn't show Vashti any mercy on April 30th, 2011. I'm taking into account the provisions of the Kansas sentencing guidelines which provide, and I quote, "Dangerous offenders shall be correctively treated in custody for long terms as needed," unquote. You're a dangerous offender. Therefore, I impose the following sentences. On the primary, what I consider to be primary, I understand the sentencing guidelines require it different on the journal entry, but on the primary conviction of intentional premeditated murder in the first degree, I impose a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years. On the aggravated arson conviction, I impose the maximum sentence of 61 months in the custody of the Secretary of Corrections. On each count of aggravated endangering of a child, I impose a 7-month sentence. That would be a total of 14 months for those two sentences. Each sentence is consecutive to the other for a total sentence of 31 years, 3 months. This is the maximum total sentence I can impose upon you under Kansas law. You'll earn good time only on the aggravated arson and aggravated endangering of a child charges. You'll receive credit for all time you've served to the date of your transfer to the Kansas Department of Corrections. Additionally, if you ever are paroled, you will be on lifetime parole supervision, and you will be required as part of any parole plan to repay the Kansas Crime Victims Compensation Fund the sum of what I believe to be, with the latest appointment, $11,266.78, plus any additional amounts incurred by the family and paid by the fund after today's date. Because I've imposed these sentences and you are going to be behind bars for the next 3 decades, at least, I'm not assessing any fines, any attorney fees, or other costs herein. They're all waived, as you will have no ability to pay them. Additionally, I have been advised by the sheriff that you have been registered as an offender under the Kansas Offender Registration Act. Mr. Falk advises me that he has gone over the Kansas Offender Registration Act requirements with you, and Mr. Falk, you have obtained a signature on a form from Mr. Seacat.
I have not, Your Honor, because he already registered as an offender. That form simply says that he's aware he needs to register within 72 hours. And since he's already done that, and he's already aware of that, I did not have him sign the form.
Okay, but you did visit with him about it.
Yes, Your Honor, I provided him with copies of the KDI materials on it, copies of other materials, including the statutes and case law, and explained to him his need to register.
Very good. Well, Mr. Seacat, if you are ever paroled, you will be required to register within 3 business days of coming into the county or jurisdiction in which you reside or intend to reside. You will need to report at least 4 times a year in person, and you will need to comply with all other terms and provisions of the Kansas Offender Registration Act. If you are paroled, you will receive written notice from the Kansas Department of Corrections at the time of your release. You mentioned the spotlight had been on this case for quite some time. The spotlight wasn't on me, Mr. Seacat, it was on you. And now, thankfully, it goes out. Because of your law enforcement career, you are going to be placed, I would assume, in the relative darkness and isolation of secure segregation in the Kansas penal system. Alone, I hope to reflect each and every day on your failure to get away with these crimes, even though you thought you'd committed the perfect crime. On the lifelong permanent damage that you did to your sons, that you've done to the Forrest and Hostetler families, and also to your family. You have a right to appeal your conviction and sentence. If you're ever paroled, you're prohibited from owning a firearm. You'll receive written notice of that. I do find that you committed a person felony in this case with a firearm. I find that you are a violent offender and are subject to registration. And as I said earlier, enter a lifetime parole order.